honestly, I don't know what's coming. I think we probably tend to. Everybody thinks that they're living in the worst possible times, and life is still actually quite comfortable for us. But there's dark clouds on the horizon. And you mentioned civil war. I mean, if you're on social media a lot, I think that you probably feel like that's more of a reality than people who aren't on social media. But yeah, it could get pretty dark. It could get pretty, especially in this place where we live. I think the 2020 riots were a strange phenomenon in our little part of the world. And what does this mean? How do we respond? What do we do? And but that's been, we're going to follow Jesus. We're going to do what he did. We're going to keep our eyes on him. And he's the master over the storm, and he's going to get his people through this.
Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest. Hey, thanks for joining us for this episode. My name is Gabe Kolstad. I'm from Westside Community Church in Beaverton, Oregon, and I'm here with Oshua Hawthorne from Brilliance Labs. How you doing, Osh?
What's up, Gabe? Good to see you, man.
Good to see you. We're having a blast over here in our Westside studio, and thanks for driving across town today.
Sure thing.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry we're going to have to edit this. I forgot your last name.
Smith.
Okay. And we're here with Devin Smith from Trinity Reformed Church, which I believe is like right here in the same neighborhood we're in right now.
That's right.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So we'd love to know a little bit about the church, about your family. Tell us about yourself.
Sure. Well, we planted in August of 2023, and it's a plant of about there's about 50 of us.
Okay.
We started with about 40. We lived over here in Beaverton, Hillsborough area, and but what we all had in common is that we had been attending a church in Oregon City, and making that drive. A number of us for a number of years had been asking, like, can we plant over here?
Yeah,
is time, and I think they had tried some Bible studies and other things before, but it just wasn't the right season. COVID happened and things like that. That church has been around for 30 years and well established, and they were kind of like growing out of their building. And so that also put a kind of a pressure on, like, here's a way that we can kind of a little release valve and send
That's a blessing.
One of our pastors and who lives over there, and and so we set a date and made a run for it. Never done a church plant before or anything like that, but it's been an adventure.
And that's cool.
Yeah.
So, what made you decide to say yes to that opportunity? Because I'm sure that it came with a whole different set of complexities than you'd been dealing with before.
Yeah. It's true. I don't. About 17 years ago, I helped to start a school in Southern California. A group of people approached me, said, we'd like to start a school. I was a school teacher. And we kind of threw our whole hat in with that and got involved with that. And it was really great blessing, a lot of difficulty. There's just so many things that you just don't anticipate. There are going to be challenges, and so we knew going into this that there's going to be all kinds of unexpected difficulties and things like that. But I think what that prepared us for is, like, we survived that really well. The Lord brought us through that. We're a strong family. We love each other, love the Lord, good community. And so I think that resilience and that experience helped us to prepare us for
That's
this.
great.
Yeah.
So you were already living over here for 7 years. And what was it about this community that made you want to lean into this particular community?
Can you guys specifically say what community you guys are in for those that don't?
Yeah, so let me rephrase that question.
Sure.
Okay, so you're over here in technically Aloha, Oregon, right? And what was it about this community that drew you to say, yeah, we want to do that there? And besides that, you already lived here.
Well, we've never believed that driving a long way to church is going to be the long-term thing. We've actually, over the last probably 4 or 5 years, have made some moves to move our way over there to be closer to our church community, we always want to live near our church. And I think that's important because of hospitality, community, inviting your neighbors to church. There's just so many things. Since we've planted the church, it's been amazing how some of our relationships with our neighbors have changed. You see them differently. Like these are people that need to go to church. What are you as opposed to getting in the car early on Sunday morning and heading off 45 minutes somewhere else. So that's been that's a value that we have, that we want to, all of the people that were a part of the church, this is their community. This is where they live and work and go to school. Their kids are in school. My kids go to St. Stephen's Academy, or they did go to St. Stephen's Academy. Two of them have graduated. And so this is our local community. It's where God has planted us, and we really believe in, just growing where you're planted.
Yeah, yeah. Have you noticed in the 7 years that you've lived here, have you noticed any changes?
Yeah. Significant changes. In my little neighborhood has there's been some new development in there. There's some new apartment complexes and things that have gone up, but there's a mosque in just a few blocks away from our house. And when we first moved here, I think that there was a handful of people that kind of wandered in there on a Friday or during one of their festivals. And now I literally think it's like a mega mosque. It's like hundreds and hundreds of people walking through the community to go to their prayer time and their festivals. So there's been a immigration into the Aloha area that I'd like to learn more about and understand better. I don't know, but just the demographic shift. Ours is a really interesting kind of a mixture of some, tech workers and some hillbillies that lived here for 50 years, and they got 7 cars on their property, and then Muslim immigrants from some place in the Middle East. It's just like it's a really, really interesting place. It's an interesting time to live here and do our work.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being with us today, and glad to have a new friend in the community.
Yeah, and I'll stop giving you such a hard time for being in like the suburbs.
Exactly.
Because
this is not just like
you're in the hood.
Not all
West
suburbs
Side
are
has a hood. Believe it or not,
it's here, right here,
right
and
here.
we proudly wave that flag.
Yeah. So my first introduction to you, Devin, was at a conference that your church and a couple other sister churches hosted called the Blue State conference. And I have a friend that goes to one of those churches, and he was attending. I thought, hey, this would be fun. We around our dinner table, we talk Bible, we talk politics and current events, and I thought, oh, this will be a neat, just a biblical perspective on a public theology and life in this current context and state that we live in. So I took my wife and older kids and had a great time. And but I wonder if you would just chat a little bit about what your vision was for that conference, and like, well, what does that mean to do ministry in a blue state?
Sure. Yeah, the name Blue State Conference came about from just some kind of a idea session where we just sat around and kind of like came up with ideas, and one of the people there just thought that was catchy, and hey, this is who we are, this is where we're at, these people, we need to say something about the situation where we're in. I think, just in our specific context here in Oregon, Washington, California. But that was really about as far as it was. Like, we live in a blue state.
It was really a branding decision.
It was kind of a branding decision. It was kind of, but then we started to think, like, do we have something to say to this situation? We do. I believe Christians have a calling in these places. One of the factors that was behind that has been watching a lot of our friends move away. We lived in California. We saw people leaving Texas, Idaho, different places, Midwest. Some fleeing and some just fed up and leaving, and all different kinds of things. Some people just taking better job and greener pastures. Very few people coming. It was kind of a one-way direction. I'm sure you guys have seen some of that. I don't know if that's exhausted itself or if we're due for another round of that and another, COVID 25 or
We
COVID
are on a
26
certain trajectory in this city.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the things that we thought we would address was the idea of we're not going to tell everybody to stay, but if you're going to stay, there is a calling here. The Lord has work for you to do here. The Lord has a calling upon you here. He does good work in difficult places much more difficult than Portland. And he he's not going to abandon his people here. So I thought that might be a good kind of a theme for a conference and to try to encourage people. And so that was kind of the genesis. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, and maybe I came at it thinking, oh, this is about like a Christian view of politics, and this is going to be about red versus blue.
Yeah.
Because it was branded as, hey, we're doing ministry in a blue state.
Right.
But then you're absolutely right. Like what I experienced when I attended, it was more of a theology conference. It was more of a here's how to persevere in a hard place and in a hard time. And that was a lot more the emphasis. I mean, there was like C.R. Wiley went to give us a history lesson of secular Western philosophy and why are certain belief systems the way they are, and that was very important, almost like a cultural apologetic in this current context. But you're right. I definitely heard that, like that call to persevere and stay in the hard place and be distinct. And I wonder if you'd tease out a little bit more the importance of that role of theology, where like there was a whole session on eschatology, for example, which I wasn't expecting. And
I wasn't either.
Yeah. So yeah, and I'm not asking you to preach that brother's sermon, but just in general, as Christians think about how we do ministry in a context that is not Christian, like Christianized,
sure,
or some would even say it's more anti Christian, and so how does theology and which doctrines or places in the scriptures do you go to inform your church in thinking about interacting in the public space?
Yeah. Well, yeah, to speak to, I mean, for instance, just that issue of eschatology is a really important factor in that, because while I think we can all agree that our city is on a certain kind of trajectory, my eschatology says that, there's still a story that's going to be told. It's going to be a positive story. This land belongs to Jesus, and he's not going to relinquish it. And he's going to do great works here, and so this isn't going to be the end of that story. That's my eschatology. I grew up a traditional dispensationalist, and I don't want to caricature that, but I did in my mind have this idea that it was all over. I wondered if I was going to get married, and I thought it was nearly the end, and I still somewhat believe that. I just believe it's not necessarily the end of the world. It's just the end of maybe our world as we know it, and not necessarily the end of our people, like annihilated. It's just the end of a way of life. It really does seem like we're in this kind of a terminus point of our civilization. It's going to go through a major transition. But so that's one way in which your theology can kind of impact the way you speak to what's happening around you. The way in which I talk to my kids is to look at all these things, and I try to make them as much aware. It sounds like you much the same way. Try to make them as much aware of all these things that are happening around them, but not to despair, and to persevere. Christ has preserved his people through difficult situations before. And, the story of the church is like this. It's not just this one steady line, and we go through ups and downs. So to expect those things, not to just simply look at the newspaper and be like, oh no, we're done. And it's not how the story I believe is going to go. So just a number of places in which I would go is obvious. There's people, when you think of like public policy, politics, it's like Genesis 9, or like Romans 13. Those are common passages that get brought up. My church, we're Presbyterians, and we believe we subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, and there's some wisdom in the Westminster Confession of Faith, which I think is very helpful to us. It's chapter 19, paragraph 4, where they are dividing the law into 3 different sections. So there's there's a ceremonial law, which they say is fulfilled in Christ and his relationship to the church. There's the moral law, which they say still applies to our lives. The apostles quote moral law all the time. And then he says this, as to them also, to Israel, as a body politic, he gave sundry judicial laws, which expired together with the state of that people. So when you go to the Old Testament, you can't just simply pull those laws right out of context. I mean, you're going to make some pretty egregious errors and do that. And it says, not obliging any other now, further than the general equity thereof may require. And it's that last little clause that I think is really, really helpful and has a lot of wisdom in it. And it helps to explain the last 500, 600, 700 years of church history and how it's interacted with the state, why we've had Christian magistrates, where principles of common law in our land have come from. And
can you translate that for modern English?
Sorry,
just say it again for the listeners and for me.
So we come from a long tradition of looking to the scriptures for wisdom as to how to govern ourselves, how to build a Christian civilization. And different Christian traditions, more of the Anabaptist traditions believe that that's completely wrong. We need to be more separated, these things. But all throughout Western civilization, there's just this long tradition of these things being an engagement. And being in engagement, they're learning from one another. And the point that I was going to make from that thing is that it's a mistake to go back into the Old Testament and just grab a law and say, like, we need to do this today. But they say we need to learn from what the general equity thereof would require, which is that when you see a principle being taught here, you see some principle of justice, of truth, of right jurisprudence, of civic family relations and things like that. When you see that, and you can abstract from that a principle, you should make application of it. That's what wisdom would say. Yeah. So I believe that we have a treasure chest of all manner of wisdom with which to speak to Western civilization to help us navigate these treacherous times we live in. And but it certainly doesn't mean that. So my tradition, we come from a group called Reconstructionists, and among those were people who wanted to go back and reclaim parts of the Old Testament law and bring it back into use in modern civilization. The way in which that sometimes was articulated was, I think, very clumsily. We just grab these laws and we're just gonna apply it here in 2024 and seek, or if we get a Christian president, or we get a majority in Congress or something like that, or we're gonna start a Christian party, then we're gonna just immediately start pumping in the Leviticus and Numbers. Does that make sense? So, but that's not how that process took place anyway. Going back, Alfred the Great, Charlemagne, these people had scholars that interpreted the scriptures to them, by which they built, what we commonly today is just English common law. That has a scriptural foundation for it. As that scriptural foundation is pushed away, we're just going to see that crumble more and more, right? It's just arbitrary power. So that's kind of my how I would respond to that, the way that I would think about that.
So one other question about the conference, and then we'll get to some of gave thoughts and questions. So the liturgy, right, was very deliberate. The Psalms, you guys sung some from the Psalter. There was even a 4-part harmony song that we sang.
The fugue.
A fugue. I don't even know what that means, but it was beautiful.
Sounds cool.
It was beautiful. And so my kids made a comment, and they're just kind of asking questions about, okay, this felt very different, and from the church that we're used to, and then there was one of the kids was saying, they were pretty. There was a lot of like critiquing of culture and Western kind of secularism and all this, and so we're driving in our van back home, and I just as a good dad, I'm full of dad jokes and pithy analogies. That's my superpower.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, kids, it's like this. And I said, you know how you got into this van at the end of the hot day, right? It was hot in here. The air was more humid. It smelled like your little sister's old like cheeseburger that she had yesterday that got left in the van. Like it has its own distinct aura as you enter into it because the windows were up. And I said, that's kind of how like these churches, they like doing church like that. If the outside is Portland culture and secularism and all these ideas, they say, well, when you go into church, it should feel entirely different. This is a taste of heaven, right? This is the new kingdom. This is it should smell different, and feel different, and be distinctive. And I think of like Os Guinness's book, Prophetic Untimeliness. Like that's actually what gives you a voice into a time and culture is be different. If you're all the same, we're like, okay, we can go to a U2 concert. I don't need your whatever fancy worship band. And so it's strategically distinctive for a reason. And I said, now our church that the family is more used to, we keep the windows halfway down, or maybe like a third down, right? Where there's some other air that comes in and flows through, and some of our air gets out, and there's distinction, but it's not this radical distinction. And then I said, and then other churches, they're convertible, and they just put the top down, and their hair's blowing in the wind, and they're hanging out the door, and it's hard to tell any difference between the U2 concert and kind of the secular culture and going into the church, at least culturally and with the liturgy, right? It feels very similar.
Sure.
And that was my way to try to help my kids understand there's different ways that different traditions will do church, and each one will have a reason for why they're doing it. So I'd be curious, am I off base in saying that? Are there some distinctive decisions that you as a pastor make with how you do liturgy in church? And I'd love to just kind of hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. No, that's a great analogy. I do you mind if I use it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, I'd probably write that down and use that in a sermon maybe this weekend. I think that there's a lot to that. The one thing in which I think, let me just throw another, I don't know how to add another dimension to that liturgy, except maybe to like pull out a scrapbook or something like that. But there are other ways to open windows. There's other, maybe it's where we drive or something like that, another dynamic. And the other cultural dynamic, I'm for being utterly, like bring in the culture. I really don't feel like we have much choice. You have to sing something.
People come in the door.
You have to wear something. We have to do something. We have the things that we have in front of us to choose from. But what I would want to do, G.K. Chesterton he has this line in his book Orthodoxy where he says he wants to be the most democratic of all people, but he wants to include all the dead in the voting. And the idea being awesome. That it not just that we're not just listening to the people that are alive here on this earth, because their perspective is actually quite limited. So long as I'm all for being cultural and contextual, so long as you allow those people to speak as well. And I believe that's actually it's aesthetically, you guys probably enjoy music earlier than your children. And you've probably had moments where you're trying to turn them on to like, listen to this rock music in the 70s is actually a little better than the rock, you're like,
Exactly.
you're trying to push them into some other things. And I feel like sometimes that's what we're trying to do with our people. We're not speaking, necessarily prophetically to the broader culture, but with our people, we're trying to push them into, some of these songs that were written in the time of the Reformation. Some of them are really beautiful. Some of these things are really beautiful. Some of these songs that we don't necessarily have the music from the early Middle Ages, but you have these lyrics that have been preserved for a long time. There's parts of our liturgy that what we do that go back to, 2nd century, and that's, I think that's important to us, that we're listening to all of those voices, if that makes sense. C.S. Lewis, in his introduction to Athanasius on the Incarnation, so he wrote an introduction to a very, very old book, but he speaks of this idea of just opening. I think he uses a similar analogy, but that it's so important for us to realize what we are. You have to get outside of your own time. You have to read old books. You got to read books that are older than 100 years old, and from that perspective, you can then look back on your own time and you have a different perspective on it. So, anyway, those would be the things that I would just say to kind of complement what you're saying. I think it's a helpful analogy, but I would try to add that other dimension of time to it as well.
So you are kind of you're turning up the AC, but it's pulling in from centuries of church history.
That sounds horrific, but yeah,
heritage.
I think this metaphor might be breaking down a little bit.
Might be breaking down. Yeah.
I would just jump in here and say, if I was to answer the question, which kind of vehicle is our church? I think it might be a dune buggy. I'm just saying, just wind flying, and I guess the reason why I actually am serious a little bit about that is that I feel like sometimes it's about barriers. And so for me personally, my take on culture and theology is that they are distinct. And I do appreciate, Devin, what you just kind of alluded to when you said you have to wear something, right? I mean, you have to sing something.
Yeah.
We're all embracing culture. It's just which culture. And I don't think there's anything either evil or holy about culture. I think there is something very holy or evil about theology. And I think that for me, I guess I early on swallowed the hook of mere Christianity, the idea that it is the elemental theology that we are here to present, like Paul did in Athens, to present like Jesus did on the hill, in a place and in a time that is very distinct, and people in those places and times were talking about very certain things and eating very certain things and doing very certain things. And then there were some of those things that they went beyond cultural to moral, right? Good or bad, and something that God would speak into. And I think for us, for me, I definitely see the role of the church as a missionary. And, in Paul's words, I become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some, which hopefully then is, we're in the car and there is as much opportunity for the gospel to move out of it, as possible. That's my take. And I know there's downsides to that. I look at it like, if the church is like if you think of it as a building, I know it's not a building, but if you think of it as a building and somebody's trying to enter this body, what's the tripping hazard getting in? And so how do we remove every possible barrier that's not elemental theology? So in that sense, to answer the question that maybe somebody's wondering is, do we have a haze machine at our church? The answer is yes, we do. And I know Joshua loves that because he loves that stuff, the haze machines.
When I go to rock concerts.
Right, yeah. So, yeah, we do. We do have the haze machine and the lights and the moving lights and everything. But again, I think it's like part of that is too, which unique people group has a congregation been asked by God to serve?
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that changes. So then it's not better or worse. It's just, do we build bridges with the population that we've been called to serve, and how do we do that? That's my take on it, which I know is maybe a little bit different than others, but I do appreciate the perspective.
Yeah. I don't necessarily have a disagreement with what you're saying per se. I think that we need to be very aware of our cultural versus scriptural, distinctives, certainly. And one of the things in which we spend quite a bit of time trying to articulate is the distinction between those two. Of like, we do this, like I said, because we have decisions we have to make, and we need to do this a certain way, and this is why we try to point things to Scripture as much as we can to draw principles. But making distinction between that and, like you said, like clear ethical guidelines and things like that. It's interesting you pointed to Mere Christianity, because that in and of itself is it's a fascinating cultural artifact of what he's doing in that book, and highlighting these core key doctrines, right? And I really believe that there is a periphery of, like I said, Westminster Confession of Faith. So it's this big bulk of doctrine, but there is this core body of Christianity, which I believe very much is a treasure, it's a cultural artifact, and I think that's what Lewis is trying to get at. He's saying, like, this tradition here, and this tradition here, and this tradition here, and they like, I think in the introduction he says, I had all these different people read it and say, and sign off on it, and that. My fear is that we're even losing something of that, right? If you were to articulate,
for sure, yeah.
If you were to hand Mere Christianity to an average evangelical, definitely in certain parts of the country where that word is just kind of lost its meaning. That core body of doctrine that is kind of, it's become something very deep and profound and mysterious, or something like that.
Well, and I was really not necessarily referring to C.S. Lewis's work as much as the concept of mere Christianity or elemental theology. But I love the book. I love the work. I love the idea that there are these core things. And I think you're right. It's probably feels really robust to anybody looking at it from today's perspective. Yeah.
So then what would you say? So if we're keeping with the dune buggy analogy, like, it makes sense. You're saying, hey, the windows are down. We have more access to be able to share the gospel outside the culture because there's more interoperability, right? Between our church community and the church. So, and in the view that says that we want to be distinctive, not just morally, but it's that, right? There's culture and morality always there's overlap, and there's and like, even thinking about the C.R. Wiley session where he's going back and he's saying there's historical roots to these things, even coming to like modern day evangelism, that you go back to McGravern's work at Fuller Seminary, and they applied missionary principles to and they turned into church growth principles, and they said we're gonna practice the homogeneous unit principle, and we're gonna do these things that are gonna use these kind of missionary concepts, but we're going to apply them to subcultures and generations within the kind of the American context, and then you get big box church, you get more of the seeker sensitive movement, you get these different movements, which then tend to take American culture, which is consumeristic, which is market driven. And you're forced to ask questions like, how much of our missionary activities are actually just borrowing from market strategies? And so then you have to ask, there's like the deeper questions of like, well, what are the unintended consequences of adopting market strategies as an example? And so, and this is not a specific challenge to you, but just got a question like, I'd want to know from you, like, what does evangelism therefore look like as a church plant that's trying to specifically keep the windows more up and try to be more distinctive? Like, where does the gospel go out? And then I would ask you, like, how do you then also critically think about, are we adopting market strategies that actually aren't coming from historical mere Christianity, but are coming from like, modern corporate lingo or strategy,
Sure.
whatever.
Yeah.
So, evangelistic strategies while your windows are up. That sounds like a title to a book, a highly contextualized book. So I've been involved in Christian education for 20 years. With, I would say, in that context, the windows pretty tight Christian bubble. But out of that church has flown or has flowed, out of that school that was started there, like, it has flowed like church life. There have been converts that have come out of that. It's like, so we believe that at the heart of whatever this is needs to be a living thing, and living things will reproduce. I think I wouldn't call myself like an evangelistic strategist or something like that, except in this regard, to as a pastor, my responsibility, my calling is to see to the life of this organism as best I can, to feed it, to care for it, to provide for it, and protect it, and to place in front of it, the calling to make disciples as part of that, right? Is to reach your neighbors, love your neighbors, and care for them. And if it's a living organism, it will reproduce. It will, it will do what it does. And that's always been, from my perspective, the priority is that this would be a living thing. So windows up, windows down, I'm not sure that analogy works in that regard, but that's where I would place the emphasis first and foremost, is my calling as a shepherd. I want this to be a thriving, hospitality showing, loving, caring community.
And that's contagious.
And then that will be
when the church is healthy, when the church is vibrant, when people are happy to be there, they have joy and love. People see that, right? And that's where,
yeah. As far as actual, you would be much more the expert in terms of outreach strategies and things like. I'm assuming with your work at Multiply PDX, and but I do some very ineffective campus evangelism at Portland State. Just starting cold conversations and things like that. So I don't have great wisdom and insight as to how to. So I have a dream of starting a broader campus ministry in PCC someday. And there's very little shepherding going on with these young people.
Yeah,
and it's
gosh, this week is needed. Yeah, at Portland State. Yeah.
And would you say also that your Sunday gathering, do you view that as evangelistic, or do you view that primarily as like equipping for the body and worship to God?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. People have come to our services and wondered where the gospel presentation is. We do communion every week. Every single week, we're contemplating the death and of Christ's atonement. Every week, I invite people to come. Every week, we invite people to faith, but it may not have that kind of traditional. I would call it more of a revivalistic type of a mode. But the gospel is the food by which I feed my people. So. I don't ever want to be a church where people would go, I don't know what the gospel is. We don't ever hear the gospel.
That's good.
So I want that to be heard every week, loud and clear. We've been working through the Gospel of Mark. We're in chapter 10 this year, and I just believe it's been a rich feast, not my preaching, but just the gospel. And so, yeah, has that been evangelistic? There have been a number of unbelievers that have come that we've had some real critical conversations. We're a small little group, but and I think it's been good, and it will bear fruit as you proclaim the gospel. Yeah. So
yeah, awesome. You don't have to answer my question.
No, I love that question. I think you used the words "make disciples." Absolutely, I think that's the name of the game. Jesus made that super clear, and I think that different congregations should do that differently. There's uniqueness in the bodies. There's unique backgrounds and experiences and competencies and personality types, and so I think. I know this is a trite old saying, but I think it takes all kinds of churches to reach all kinds of people. And so I think anyone who feels like they're doing it better than the other guys probably needs a reality check, And so I think we do what we feel like led to do in the power of the Spirit and according to the guidance of Scripture. And, having said all that, we feel very strongly about having an approach to evangelism that invites the widest possible audience in. One of the ways we sort of evaluate our approach is church experience required, or can we offer an experience where church experience is not required, and remove that barrier? So. I love the idea. Well, strategy, big time. I love strategy around evangelism, and I think strategy, maybe in my opinion, is also not something that's either holy or unholy in terms of is this a Christian strategy? Does it have roots in the early American Christian church or the European Christian church or whatever, or is strategy neutral? And as long as it's not evil, as long as there's not a worldly evil piece to it, So does that mean you shouldn't use lead generators on your website if you're a church? We do. Why not? Somebody's going to pop on our website. How do we capture their contact so we can have a relationship with them? What do we do with that contact? For us, discipleship is simple, and we've identified 3 moves that we want to move people toward. One is connection to Christ through salvation. One is connection to community in the body of Christ, and one is connection to mission. And so, we just do everything we can to move people through that kind of growth strategy as healthily as possible. So, I think windows down or windows up, we should all have a strategy that connects with the culture in a way that allows people that whatever the target is that God has called us to reach as missionaries, then how are we going to interact with those people in their sort of in their language, so to speak? So that's our basic approach.
And I think that's a great point, is that it takes different types of churches to reach different types of people. Right, I started my first church planting journey during the emerging church days, where you had all these people disillusioned by mega church and big box church kind of culture, and they're like, I want something ancient, I want something rooted, and there was this movement to go back to smells and bells and more like liturgical ways of worship, and some of that was just like trendy, shallow, but I think it also pointed to a deeper hunger that we have for a rootedness and a groundedness of truth that has survived the centuries, right? Like we can look at a hymnal that has a lot of old songs, and you're like, these are the greatest hits. This is the greatest hits of the last about 2,000 years. Yeah. And we have a lot of modern music. How many of those are going to survive in 100 years? Well, the best ones, right? A handful of them. We don't know what they are yet. And so there is that value of like, let's go old school. Let's go like 16th, 17th century old school, because we know this stood the test of time, and we still have it today. So I'm looking at the clock, and I wonder. I think maybe one last question we'll save for next time, the really hard political question that we considered. But I'm wondering, what about, okay, so we're talking about thinking about ministering faithfully in this blue state, and it just happens to be 2024. And we all know what that means, that there's going to be an election in November.
Is there?
If we survive until then. Yes,
exactly.
We actually don't know, right? Whether we get there or we don't know if there's a civil war afterwards. But either way, we're in a place that's known for being having some volatility around elections. So how are you guys preparing your churches for that time? How are you talking about it? What does that look like to kind of take advantage of this season for fruitfully for ministry in the midst of that challenge?
Yeah. Well, you gave me this question before, and I was just thinking of how to answer it. I don't do a lot of preaching on politics or anything like that, or Sunday school. For Sunday school, we go through our catechism. At least right now, that's what we've been doing. But it comes up in sermon texts and things like that from time to time. But we tend not to try to like jump onto just a kind of an immediate political thing, maybe as an illustration or something like that. The primary way in which I think I'm trying to prepare my people for what I think is coming has been, I chose the Gospel of Mark to be a kind of first of all, the Gospel of Mark is, the whole structure of the Gospel is kind of it's like a journey, right? It's the one where the most action, the least amount of teaching. And, the very first couple verses, it says, quoting Isaiah, that, he'll send the forerunner ahead of Jesus and he will make your paths straight. And then, just right there in the first couple verses, it tells you like, this is going to be about the straight paths of Jesus. The same word is found throughout Mark. It's translated in English strangely, immediately. But it's the adverb form of that, and it's the King James, I think, did a better job. They translated it straight away. And as you read through Mark, that word, it starts with all of these great things that God is doing, miracles and a great healing and a great this and that. And then suddenly, very, very quickly in the first couple of chapters, and straight away a demon appears in the synagogue. And straight away Pharisees begin questioning Jesus and pushing back on these things. And straight away, and what's very clear is that these straight paths of Jesus are not straight by how the world would define straight paths, right? So Mark is a story of walking through suffering into glory, right? And the theme verse of Mark would be, take up your cross and follow me, right? For he who would save his life will lose it, but he who would lose his life for my sake in the Gospels will find it. And so that's been my preparation, how I'm thinking about this year. Honestly, I don't know what's coming. I think we probably tend to. Everybody thinks that they're living in the worst of all possible times, and life is still actually quite comfortable for us. But there's dark clouds on the horizon, and you mentioned civil war. I mean, if you're on social media a lot, I think that you probably feel like that's more of a reality than people who aren't on social media. But it could get pretty dark. It could get pretty, especially in this place where we live. I think the 2020 riots were a strange phenomenon in our little part of the world, and what does this mean? How do we respond? What do we do? And but that's been, we're going to follow Jesus. We're going to do what he did. We're going to keep our eyes on him, and he's the master over the storm, and he's going to get his people through this. So,
Amen. Gabe, what are you doing? What are you guys doing?
Basically just putting my head in the sand and hoping that it all goes away is pretty much my plan. No, I think
ostrich strategy.
Yeah, ostrich strategy. I think this has got potential to be a little uncomfortable, because you even see, I referenced a little bit ago, like these riots at Portland State this week over a different topic. It's like, I think in some ways our culture has learned that if you don't like something, that's the response, right? And so it could get a little crazy, I think, around here. But maybe the prep for divisiveness in general isn't new. And I wonder so I think what we're trying to do is figure out, how do we help people see themselves as agents of Christ and see the world as Christ does, as sheep without a shepherd, and then maybe have some compassion on people even that they disagree with, or that maybe are even agitated or aggressive, maybe to ask the question, why? And see if we could have some concern there, and not necessarily have to come down on which side we agree with, but to see a person as a person that has questions, needs, concerns, and try to figure out, how do we put ourselves in a place of service, not necessarily to try to correct all the stuff that's going on, because I don't think that's ever going to be possible, at least not from my standpoint in a season like that. So maybe it's just, for me, a little bit about service and compassion. We're trying to figure out, how do we position ourselves in that place. Awesome.
Well, Devin, it's great having this conversation. How would our audience learn more about your church, your ministry?
Sure.
How could they connect with you?
Our website's TRCNW, Trinity Reformed Church, Northwest.org. And services 9:30 Sunday school, 10:30 church. And
Awesome.
Reach out to us. There's connection on the
Are you active on social media? Are there other ways?
I try. This is another thing we could come back and talk about. I'm much more of a, I'll jump in for a little bit, and then it's like, I'll run out with my with my hair screwed. Like, I don't want to get too involved, but try to be friendly and then I'm gonna check out for a little while. So not super active on social media, but well, thank you.
Thanks, Devin. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having
it's good to
me.
get to know you a little bit.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to ask you a quick favor. Would you please subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and share with those that are in your life that might benefit from the content. Hit the notifications button, rate and review, of course, and then head on over to upperleftshow.com, where you can find bonus content, opportunities to connect with those around the city that are doing similar work as you, resources to help you, and just a way to connect to the community. We hope to see you again next time.